There is a strip mall in central Ohio that tells you everything you need to know before a single number gets mentioned. The Bed Bath & Beyond is already gone, paper over the windows, the sign brackets still bolted to the brick, but holding nothing. Next door, a Rite Aid with a handwritten note taped to the glass. Pharmacy services transferred to a location 14 miles away. The Dollar Tree 2 spaces down still has its lights on. For now, nobody declared an emergency here. There was no press release, no town hall, no moment where someone official stood up and said something has changed. The stores just quietly stopped being there, one lease at a time, until the parking lot that used to fill up on Saturday mornings started feeling like something you drive past without quite looking at. That feeling has a number attached to it in 2026, and the number is 15,000. That is the scale retail analysts projected for this contraction cycle, nearly 15,000 store closures annually as 2025 rolled into 2026, according to CoreSite Research, which has tracked retail opening and closing patterns for over a decade. Not 15,000 brands. Not 15,000 companies. 15,000 individual locations. 15,000 specific street addresses where something used to be open and now is not. To put that into scale that actually lands, that is roughly 40 stores closing every single day. Before most people finish their morning coffee on a Monday, 3 more pharmacies, 2 more grocery outlets, and a clothing chain somewhere in this country have locked their doors for the last time. Most coverage of this treats it as a business story. Stock prices, earnings calls. The strategic rationale behind a restructuring plan announced on a quarterly investor call. That frame is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. The real story is not what happens to the company. The real story is what happens to the place. The neighborhood that did not get a vote. The small town where the anchor store closing did not just end a shopping option, it ended the reason people came downtown at all. The rural county, where the nearest pharmacy is now a 25-minute drive for someone who stopped driving 2 years ago. When a company closes a store, it runs a financial model, posts a filing, and moves on. The community does not move on. It absorbs the loss and figures out how to function around the gap, or it does not. And in 2026, the gaps are opening faster than at any point in recent American retail history in places that were already operating with almost nothing left to lose. This video is not about the companies. It is about what gets left behind when they go. And by the end of it, the parking lot in Ohio is going to look a lot less like an isolated story and a lot more like the early frame of something much larger that is already well underway. Here is something the retail industry understands clearly, but almost never says in public. When a company decides which stores to close, it runs a model. Revenue per square foot, lease cost relative to traffic trends, demographic projections for the surrounding zip code over the next 5 years. The locations that fail the model get cut. That process is entirely rational from a business perspective. It is also not random in its geography, and the pattern it produces is worth looking at directly. CoreSite Research and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance have both documented the same consistent finding. Closures concentrate in lower-income zip codes, rural counties, and communities of color, at rates meaningfully higher than their share of the overall retail landscape. A study published in Health Affairs found that pharmacy closure rates in predominantly Black neighborhoods reached 37.5% over the study period, compared to 27.7% in predominantly white neighborhoods, a gap that persisted even after controlling for income levels. That pattern has not reversed. In most categories, it is accelerating. 3 types of communities are absorbing the heaviest impact right now, and each one tells a different version of the same story. In rural counties, the anchor store loss sets off a cascade that is difficult to stop once it starts. In Darlington County, South Carolina, where median household income sits around $48,000 and the poverty rate exceeds 21%, the pattern plays out the same way it does across rural counties from the Mississippi Delta to the Ohio Valley. An anchor retailer exits. The surrounding businesses that depended on shared foot traffic reassess their leases. Within months, the corridor that once served as the county's commercial center starts showing gaps that do not close. There is no replacement announcement pending. In low-income urban neighborhoods, the pharmacy closure wave is removing healthcare infrastructure from communities where car ownership rates are low and public transit does not conveniently connect to the next nearest option. In Chicago's South and West Sides, the series of Walgreens closures, beginning in 2025, left elderly residents managing multiple prescriptions with a transportation problem that has no clean solution. For someone on a fixed income without a car, the distance to the next pharmacy is not an inconvenience. It is a barrier to consistent medication adherence, which is a health outcome issue, not a consumer preference issue. In mid-sized cities, the feedback loop is the hardest to interrupt. An anchor closes. Foot traffic drops. Smaller tenants reassess their lease renewals. More leave. Foot traffic drops further. The next anchor looks at the numbers and reaches the same conclusion the first one did. In Youngstown, Ohio, in Rockford, Illinois, in Stockton, California, this loop has been running for years with no natural floor. The model ran, the store closed, and the community is left to figure out what comes next with whatever it has. When most people picture a store closure wave, they picture clothing boutiques and home decor shops. Discretionary spending. Things people can cut when money gets tight without any real consequence beyond inconvenience. That picture is outdated in 2026, and updating it matters because the categories closing fastest right now are not optional. Walgreens has been executing approximately 1,200 closures over a 3-year restructuring plan, with a significant portion landing in 2026. CVS completed over 900 closures between 2022 and 2024, then announced an additional 271 closures in 2025 as part of a separate restructuring plan. Rite Aid emerged from Chapter 11 bankruptcy with a footprint substantially smaller than what it entered with. When 3 of the 4 largest pharmacy chains in the country are simultaneously contracting, that is not a story about any one company's management decisions. The National Community Pharmacists Association has been direct about what comes next. Independent pharmacies, which historically filled access gaps when chains pulled back, are themselves under the same reimbursement pressure from pharmacy benefit managers that is driving the chain closures. The safety net that used to catch the people, the big chains left behind, is fraying at the same time the big chains are leaving. Researchers at the University of Southern California define pharmacy deserts as areas where residents live more than 1 mile from the nearest pharmacy in urban settings, or more than 10 miles in rural ones. Those deserts are expanding faster than at any point in the past 2 decades. The grocery picture follows the same shape. Grocery Outlet announced approximately 36 closures. Kroger is evaluating roughly 60 locations for viability. Southeastern Grocers, the parent company of Winn-Dixie and Bi-Lo, has continued closing additional locations across the Southeast. The USDA's Food Access Research Atlas currently identifies approximately 19 million Americans living in low-income areas with limited grocery access. That figure was calculated before the current closure wave fully materialized in 2026. The dollar store story is the one that surprises people most. For years, dollar stores represented retail expansion into exactly the communities larger chains had abandoned. Dollar General built over 19,000 locations, many in rural and low-income areas with no other options. In 2026, dollar stores are facing their own contraction pressure from theft losses, regulatory scrutiny, and a spending environment that has weakened even at the bottom of the market. When the option that existed specifically as the fallback starts pulling back, there is no next fallback. The closures accelerating fastest in 2026 are not removing luxuries from communities that have plenty. They are removing the thin layer of commercial infrastructure that lower income and rural communities depend on for daily function. When that layer thins past a certain point, the communities do not find substitutes. They reorganize their lives around the absence, or they cannot, and the consequences follow from there. Picture a 71-year-old woman in rural Tennessee. She stopped driving 2 years ago when her night vision became unreliable. Her nearest pharmacy just closed. The next one is 22 miles away. Her daughter works 2 jobs and cannot take off on a weekday to drive her. The mail order option her insurance now recommends requires a smartphone to set up and a credit card to process the first order. She has neither. Her prescription for blood pressure medication runs out in 11 days. This is not a hypothetical constructed for effect. It is a composite drawn directly from testimony collected by the Tennessee Justice Center in their 2024 report on rural pharmacy access. Variations of this situation are playing out across dozens of states simultaneously in communities that do not generate national news coverage because nothing dramatic enough has happened yet. The consequences are documented, though they are documented in places most people never look. A 2019 study published in Health Affairs found that pharmacy closures in low-income neighborhoods were associated with a measurable decrease in medication adherence among patients managing chronic conditions, specifically cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Patients living more than 1 mile from an open pharmacy were significantly less likely to refill prescriptions on schedule. Non-adherence to blood pressure and diabetes medications is directly linked to emergency hospitalizations. The pharmacy closes in March. The hospitalization happens in June. Nobody draws the line between them in any official accounting because the line is invisible at the system level, even when it is completely visible to the family sitting in the emergency room. The economic ripple follows the same pattern of invisible causation. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance has documented that when a significant retail employer closes in a small town, the downstream economic impact typically reaches 3 to 4 times the direct job loss. Employees stop spending at local restaurants. The property sits vacant, eroding the tax base that funds municipal services. In communities where the closed store was a top 5 employer, this sequence has been documented to accelerate population loss, which then makes the community less attractive to any replacement business, which makes the vacancy permanent. There is one more dimension to this that almost never makes it into the economic analysis, but it belongs here. Researchers at the University of Michigan, studying commercial abandonment in post-industrial Midwest cities, found that visible retail vacancy correlates with measurable increases in residents' self-reported sense of community decline, even controlling for actual economic conditions. People watching storefronts go dark and parking lots empty out are not just losing shopping options. They are watching the physical evidence of their community's viability disappear in real time. That has documented effects on civic engagement, on whether local business owners choose to reinvest, on whether young people decide to stay. The store closing is a business decision made in a corporate office far from the zip code it affects. What it leaves behind is not a business problem. It is a community absorbing a loss it did not choose and was not consulted about. And across this contraction cycle, that has been happening 40 times a day. Store closures are not new. The retail graveyard is full of names that felt permanent. Circuit City, Borders, Sears, Toys R Us. Each wave produced predictions of permanent damage, and each time the commercial landscape eventually reconfigured around the loss. The question worth asking carefully in 2026 is whether that pattern still holds, or whether something about the current conditions makes this wave structurally different from the ones that came before. The real estate market is the first signal. For decades, when a major retailer vacated a space, another tenant eventually filled it. That recycling process has broken down in ways that CBRE commercial real estate data makes visible. Strip mall and enclosed mall vacancy rates in markets outside the top 25 metropolitan areas have risen steadily since 2020 and show no consistent reversal trend. Empty storefronts in small cities and rural towns are staying empty longer than at any point in the post-war era of American retail development. The reason is not complicated. The math that makes a new retail investment attractive in a secondary or tertiary market has gotten harder to solve. The lending environment adds pressure from a different direction. The Federal Reserve's Senior Loan Officer surveys through 2024 and 2025 document sustained tightening of credit standards for small and medium business borrowers. An entrepreneur looking to open an independent pharmacy or neighborhood grocery store to fill the gap a chain left behind is navigating capital access that was measurably less restrictive. 5 years ago, the people who might replace what is leaving face real structural barriers to doing so. Then there is the demographic math, which is the hardest to argue with, because it moves slowly and does not reverse quickly. In many of the communities absorbing the highest closure rates, population is flat or declining. The customer base is aging, and income levels have not kept pace with the operating costs of running a retail location. A national chain looking at those numbers does not see an opportunity. It sees the reason it is leaving, and the previous retail contraction waves that communities eventually recovered from unfolded in single categories over extended periods. The department store consolidation of the 1990s, the bookstore collapse in the 2000s, the electronics chain failures in the 2010s. Each gave communities time to begin adjusting before the next disruption arrived. The 2026 wave is hitting pharmacies, grocers, dollar stores, fast food, and general merchandise simultaneously. The adjustment period does not exist this time. The combination of vacant real estate that is not being refilled, lending conditions that are not supporting replacement businesses, demographic trends that are not attracting new retail investment, and a closure wave hitting multiple essential categories at the same time adds up to something different from prior cycles. Not every community will experience this as permanent, but the communities that were already operating with the least margin are the ones facing the highest probability that what is leaving does not come back. The word that fits that outcome is not disruption. The word is subtraction. 15,000 closures, concentrated in the communities with the fewest alternatives, hitting pharmacies, groceries, and dollar stores that lower income and rural residents cannot easily replace. Leaving behind health access gaps that show up in emergency rooms months later, economic ripple effects that compound through local tax bases and small business ecosystems, and physical vacancy that research documents takes years to reverse when conditions are favorable and does not reverse at all when they are not. Occurring under real estate, lending, and demographic conditions that make replacement investment less likely than at any comparable point in recent decades. That is the full picture as it stands in 2026. Some responses exist. Community development financial institutions are financing independent groceries and pharmacies in underserved areas in cities including Detroit, Baltimore, and New Orleans. The USDA's Community Facilities Program provides grants and loans for essential services in rural communities. Several states have enacted pharmacy desert legislation aimed at maintaining minimum access standards within insurance networks. These efforts are real, and they are producing results in specific places. They are also operating at a fraction of the scale the problem requires, and most of the communities absorbing the heaviest losses are not in the geographic or political position to access them quickly. The harder question underneath all of this is one that programs and legislation can help with but cannot fully resolve. When a pharmacy chain closes a location, it is making a rational business decision. When a grocery chain exits a low-income market, the financial logic is defensible. Each individual decision holds up under scrutiny, evaluated collectively. Across 15,000 locations over this contraction cycle, they produce communities where filling a prescription, buying groceries, or talking to a pharmacist requires resources and mobility that a growing number of residents do not have. If the private market will not serve these communities at a profit, and public investment to fill the gap is not available at the scale required, and the entrepreneurs who might step in cannot access the capital to do it, the question that does not have a clean answer is what actually happens to the people who live there. Not eventually. Now, the 15,000 closures will be reported as business news through the rest of 2026. Restructuring plans, portfolio optimization, strategic realignment. The language is precise and the meaning is distant. Walk into the community left behind, and the language shifts. Talk to the woman who used to walk 4 blocks to the pharmacy and is now trying to solve a 22-mile problem she has no reliable way to solve. Talk to the teenager whose after-school job disappeared when the anchor store closed and the mall went quiet. Talk to the pharmacist who spent 18 years in a neighborhood and got a 90-day notice from a headquarters she had never visited. The stores are a business story. What they leave behind is not. The pace of closures may be moderating from its 2025 peak, but the communities that absorbed the worst of it are not recovering on any timeline that matches the speed at which they were hit. And the communities absorbing these losses in 2026 are not waiting for the national conversation to catch up to what they are already living. They are figuring out how to function around the gaps, one closed storefront at a time, mostly without anyone from the outside paying attention. Which one of these hits closest to where you live? Drop it in the comments. The most important version of this conversation is not happening on a cable news segment. It is happening at the local level, in the places where these decisions land, and most of the time, it is happening without anyone from the outside even knowing to look.